But at last there came a summer that we spent, drinking dreadful martinis at a roadhouse, in a castle in the south of Ireland. I suddenly found myself cloyed with this idyll of gay Irish hunting and rosy-cheeked old Irish servants, and I insisted that the things she was having us do were far too expensive for us, that my income was very much smaller than Ralph's, and that my work involved arduous researches and years of modest living, even hardship. She took the new cue at once and shifted with equal enthusiasm to a little old house on Cape Cod, where I should write by the light of an oil lamp, and she would organize my notes and type my manuscript, while the wind roared and pounded outside. "I'd work my hands to the bone for you," she said, and this profession was no less sincere than any other of the things she had projected, but it struck for me a bad note of bathos. I saw myself getting muzzy over prohibition cocktails, which had been served in depressing teacups, amid the hunting prints of the Hecate County roadhouse. These had suggested the South of Ireland dream fugue, talking idiotic might-have-beens with the wife of an advertising man, a woman I had been working on a year without making the slightest headway. "Look, Imogen," I said abruptly, "a debauch of the imagination is just as bad as any other kind of debauch. In fact, it's a good deal worse, because the experience you get out of it isn't real. If you and I are going to run away together, we ought to do it and stop spinning these fairy tales." I was all the more exasperated, of course, because actually I should not at the moment have been able to do anything about Imogen, even if she had allowed me to carry her off. "You know that we can't run away," she said, speaking softly but firmly, and dropping her eyes. "Then let's not talk all this rubbish," I answered. "I want you, but I want you not in a castle in Ireland that we might have gone to live in if things had been different, and that I loathe the idea of anyway. I want you right here and now." But I caught myself up and defined here and now in a way that would leave me a margin. "I want you this autumn, when we get to town." "I've told you," she retorted, "that if you feel like that, you'd better not see me any more." This was the move that she always made, and that was supposed to block my progress. "I'm sorry to be so irritable." I struck a candid and earnest note, "but the whole thing's been wearing me down." "It's been hard on me, too," she said, subsiding into her little girl voice. "I'm very unhappy sometimes." "Well, there's only one way to cure that," I declared, paying the check with decision. "I'll see you in town in the autumn. Is that a pact?" I demanded. "I don't promise," she said, but she blushed, and I felt I had a chance to dislodge her. I was almost afraid at this point that Imogen had been putting a spell on me. I had not been able to get rid of my disease, and the doctor seemed puzzled and worried. Could it be possible that some queer acquiescence in the role she was attempting to impose on me had been a factor in preventing my recovery? I demanded more drastic treatment, and the doctor, after a brief and frank lecture on the risks of using silver nitrate, cured me with it overnight. The balance of forces was broken. Again, I could entertain real hopes. The Loomises, by this time, it was late in September, had gone to town for the winter. They were living in the 50s in a West Side hotel, a place that was just rococo enough and gay enough to please people from Scarsdale and Larchmont. Ralph Loomis had great quantities of due bills from the companies whose advertising he placed, and he and Imogen were able to spend months using them up in the various hotels. They apologized for this one, when I called on them, by laughing about it a good deal. It seemed that one of its advertised attractions was a breakfast in a cardboard container that was poked in at you every morning through a kind of slot in the door. They said it was a wretched little breakfast and made you feel that you had been put in prison. I found with them on this occasion a small, elderly, brown-faced man, an old friend of theirs, they said, who was staying at the same hotel. The first thing I learned about him was that the sight of the put-up breakfast had disgusted him so that morning that he had hurled it down the hall after the waiter. Imogen was delighted at this and rather overdid telling about it, and as the conversation went on, I gathered that the visitor was rich, and that he had originally come from Columbus but lived on a ranch in Montana. I immediately became aware that he hugely admired Imogen, and that he had with her some special relationship. She had been ill, one of a series of illnesses which obliged her to go to bed for days, though she would never tell me what was the matter. and the visitor had brought her a bottle of Moet and Chandon champagne, which we drank sitting around the bedroom. She was flushed with the champagne and attention, and she looked very lovely in a pink negligee with mules of red and gold. Her big eyelids drooped and lifted too beautifully, and when she laughed, she would throw out from under them great beams of gratification toward the visitor from the west. It was he who was the hero of the afternoon, and I resented him with special rancor. It turned out that he had known her for years, and that he always came to see them in New York. Imogen and Edna Forbes had once spent a summer on his ranch at a time when her health had been bad, and it had done Imogen a lot of good. He was urging her to come again. "Blackie still talks about you. He always asks me if I've seen you when I come to New York." Imogen explained to me that Blackie was the rancher's head man, a great card, a splendid character, and a real old-fashioned cowboy. They repeated witty things he had said, the rancher chuckling, Imogen roaring. "Isn't she wonderful? Isn't she marvelous?" said the visitor, turning to me with the utmost geniality, when Ralph, who had had a phone call, had gone out into the other room. "She's a regular gosh-darned Helen of Troy, and who wouldn't like to steal her?" "I can't be stolen, though," said Imogen. "Let me steal you both and take you back to Montana for a month." "Ralph can't get away," said Imogen. I was relieved that she couldn't go, but the whole thing was making me uncomfortable, not only because it wasn't possible for me to compete with the ranch and the champagne in their power to exhilarate Imogen, but also because, since his interest in her was evidently the same as mine, it was discouraging for me to see him so firmly and promptly curbed. It brought home to me my own situation. I was already aware that I had not been the first to discover the wonder of Imogen. There had been another friend of theirs, an architect, who Imogen told me had claimed to be in love with her, and who had designed their house in the country, and painted a dreadful mural that covered all one end of the dining room, and included a portrait of Imogen riding a white horse. Later, he had developed TB and gone to live in Santa Fe, and I had always taken it for granted that he must have been absurdly unworthy of her. But now, suddenly, I seemed to see that the dude rancher and the architect and I were all in the same boat. Should I, too, grow middle-aged, hopelessly admiring Imogen, taking her out when her husband was busy, as it appeared that her friend from the West might perhaps have the privilege of doing, if she were well enough before he left, and being told that she could not be stolen? Was it simply that the more you admired her, the more her eyes would beam? Ralph presently returned from the telephone, and we talked about the Chicago gangsters. Ralph and the visitor both had done a good deal of business in Chicago, and had had some experience with them. Ralph, it seemed, had even known Jack Dilling, a Chicago newspaper reporter who had more or less worked with the gangsters, and who had just been murdered that fall. "He didn't like me," said Ralph, "because I was handling Ottawa Club ginger ale, and he had an interest in a local company that made both ginger ale and beer. It was all part of the underworld tie-up. At first he tried to bribe me to double-cross my account. He offered me a rake-off from the beer racket, and then, when I brushed him off, he tried to intimidate me." "Tell them how you went to dinner." Imogen's eyes were now beaming for Ralph. "What kind of fellow was he?" I asked. "He was tall and thin and pasty, and he had sort of colorless eyes that were weak but rather uneasy-looking. He always wore a big fur-lined coat that the gangsters had undoubtedly given him." "Tell them about the muskrats," Imogen eagerly urged him. "Well, the way he tried to threaten me was amusing. He asked me to dinner, and I went. This was before he had let me see that he was acting as an agent for the beer racket. He lived in an apartment that was what you might expect of a fairly well-paid reporter, but there were a few magnificent items that gave the gangster touch. A big gilt Louis XIV Victrola, for example. Dilling lay on the couch with his coat off and his collar open, and ordered his wife to do things. She was a pretty little blonde who would have been perfectly all right as the wife of a newspaper man, and was finding it, I thought, a certain amount of a strain to live up to the role of a gunman's moll. But she was trying to do her best by putting on as much makeup as a Roomba dancer at Colosimo's. She just sat around and said nothing. I tried to get her to talk, but she wouldn't. Jack evidently had her stunned. I remembered how Ana had told me that when she had first gone to work at the Tango Casino, Dan had made her plaster her face all up with 2 red spots in the middle of her cheeks. I reassured myself by remembering that I, too, as I had said to Imogen, knew something of the sinister race who in that period so fascinated the public. "Tell them about the dog," said Imogen. "Well, he had a horrible little Boston bull, one of those dogs with pink eyes that bounces around, and he told me with obvious pride that it had been on trial a couple of times for biting people. They were people that, so far as he could see, he said it had a perfect right to bite." "He wanted the dog to be a gangster, too," said Imogen. "Well, he began by going on about what wonderful fellows the Italian gangsters were. They're just like you and me," he said, "and they're the most generous and hospitable people." He told me how he'd had Christmas dinner at the home of Rudy the Rat or somebody, who had just slaughtered 3 of his rivals in a garage, and how lovable the old grandmother was, and how proud Rudy was of his children, and how the oldest boy played Verdi on the piano, and what a good-looking brunette his wife was. He said that Rudy had shot at her the week before, but she knew how to take it, he said. "She's crazy about him." We laughed. "He was just like a kid," Ralph went on, "that's been reading dime novels or pirate stories, and wants to play he's a big hold-up man or a pirate." Could my interest in Ana, I wondered, have had an element of the same sort of thing? The contemptible, vicarious excitement of feeling oneself in touch with the underworld and hearing about it at first hand? Well, when he saw that that didn't go over with me, he'd already made his little suggestion about giving me a cut on the beer-needling profits, he resorted to terroristic methods. He told me what had happened to the people who had refused to play ball with the bootleggers. One had been found thrown out of a car, one had had the top of his head blown off, and so forth. "He never knows when it's going to strike or where it's going to strike," he said. "If the boys had you down as a son of a bitch, you might be sitting here drinking cocktails, and you might never get out of this house alive." Then his wife came in from the kitchen. She'd been getting the dinner herself, and asked Jack how to cook the muskrats. He asked me in rather a menacing manner whether I'd ever eaten muskrat. He said that a trapper in Canada who helped smuggle liquor over the line had sent them down to Mike the Punk or somebody, and that Mike had wanted him to have some and had sent him a whole barrel of them. "He's the most generous guy in the world," he said. He took me out to the kitchen to see them. He evidently hoped I'd be horrified by them, and they did look pretty disgusting. They were packed in a barrel full of ice, and they looked like the corpses of skinned cats with the heads and tails and paws cut off. Well, all Jack knew about it was that you boiled them, so his wife put them into a big pot of water, and we waited about an hour. We started on a bottle of Canadian whiskey, which had been sent as a present with the muskrats. I think mixing the drinks was a part of his attempt to get me down and make me more malleable. He kept on talking about gangster murders. Finally, we attacked the muskrats. I think the truth was that they cooked them so long because they really didn't want to eat them. It turned out in the course of the dinner that Jack had never had them before, but even so they weren't cooked enough and were still rather raw in spots. Mrs. Dilling wanted to put them back, but I accepted the challenge offered, and I insisted on flying at mine and devouring it down to the bone. We asked what it had tasted like. Fishy and rank, and it was covered with a thick layer of fat which made it extremely messy, but I washed it down with the Dago wine, and then I demanded another muskrat. I'd noticed that Jack had lost interest when he discovered that his own was bloody. He'd sent it back to be boiled some more. So I tore at my second muskrat in a way that was absolutely ogreish. I abandoned the knife and fork and picked it up with my fingers, and gnawed it the way the muskrat himself would have eaten a fish, getting the fat all over my hands and face. In the meantime, I talked scornfully but humorously about how filthy politics were in Chicago. Jack only picked at his muskrat, and finally he pulled off a leg that was a little raw at the joint, and that he attempted to eat like a drumstick, and at this point he quietly disappeared and didn't come back for some time, while Mrs. Dilling and I had a very pleasant conversation about our favorite movie stars. Presently Jack reappeared, looking green around the gills. He said that the scotch had been doctored, that some son of a bitch had put alcohol in it. So that was the late Jack Dilling, who thought it was a lot of fun when his pals used to line people up in a garage and fill them full of holes with a machine gun. I don't think anybody needs to shed tears over him. His story had all been told in a drawling and easy manner that seemed only casually caustic, the manner that was fashionable for the college men of the vintage of just after the war. But the effect on me was the opposite of that of his story about the Badger hoax. I had already a sense of guilt, which was not any the less uncomfortable because I could never be sure whether I felt guilty at having tried to seduce Imogen or at not having succeeded in seducing her. And I had felt, as the story continued, that it somehow applied to me. I asked myself whether Imogen had not told him about my boasting of knowing the underworld, and I had even had the fancy that his description of Dilling had been meant as a crack at me. I, too, was tall and thin, and I had grown paler in my forest from the relative lack of exercise imposed by the demands of my cure. I, too, had been stained by that foulness. But now I was free to retrieve myself, to be clean and sincere again, to assume the full moral stature to which I had never risen. It was unthinkable to go on living in that lazy and half-baked way. If I were not going to break with Imogen, I must make her divorce Ralph and marry me. But two things I had first to accomplish. I must establish the ascendancy over Imogen which would be possible only after I had slept with her, and I must manage a bigger income. I decided to take action at once, and I persuaded an old friend of mine from college, a curator at the Metropolitan Museum, to give me a job in the painting department. I did not get any very great pay, but it was enough to make all the difference for me as between uptown New York and 12th Street. I took an apartment on Madison Avenue in the respectable Lower East 70s, within easy reach of the places where Imogen stayed during the winter. It was larger than my rooms downtown. It had a living room, a bedroom, and a kitchen, and I bought for it a chair and a couch of that simplified, functional kind, which was at that time coming into vogue, very comfortable, with light green cushions and low, wide arms that drinks could be set on. A new cocktail shaker, nickel and glass, that did not leak when you shook it like my old one. A formidable nickel-cased siphon that charged its own soda water. And new aprons for my colored maid, whom I had induced to come with me to the city. It was a walk-up on the second floor, just above a conservative florist's, and my new residence and work in that section of town, the comparative whiteness of the streets, and the straightness and space of their vistas, the restaurants so often empty that had names like Tally-Ho and Cloverbrook, the trim ladies walking Dachshunds and Scotties, the big green Fifth Avenue buses, the marbles of the Metropolitan and its hollow, resounding halls, the slow, careful handling of pictures and the silent consultation of scholarly works, the unassertive, sober air with which one walked past the guard, all this seemed to lift me to a different plane from the one I had lived on in 12th Street. I also sold an article on Renoir to one of those smart fashion magazines that run photographs of modern paintings and of art treasures brought to this country, and I bought a black derby and a new dark coat. I directed my efforts now, without showing any special ardor, to getting Imogen to come to lunch with me. I wanted to show her my new apartment, and I finally succeeded in this. She arrived 20 minutes late, and avoiding the trap of the couch, entrenched herself in the modern armchair. But she drank 2 of my streamlined cocktails. She had just been to the Renoir show and determinedly talked about it. She was excited, and under pressure of the excitement, she had one of her moments of eloquence. "They just melt on your eyes," she said. "They're what the French call fondants. They're all typical French women, just meant for sex. They marry and become mothers and just melt up in family life." "You don't think that's the thing for a woman to do?" "A woman can be so much more. She shouldn't dissolve her personality in other people." "It's only by dissolving herself," I smilingly but sententiously replied, "that a woman can find her identity." I was afraid that my perfect little lunch was almost entirely lost on her. She did not finish the avocado salad, which I had had because I thought she liked them, and she hardly touched the cream cheese and bar-le-duc. But I could see that she was dressing a new role for me. She had discarded her old romantic costuming, and now appeared as a woman of the world. Her face was smooth and fresh from a facial, and her cheekbones seemed thrown into relief so that she looked like Marlene Dietrich. "I've had my hair done a new way," she explained when I spoke of this. I made her take off her hat and was enchanted by her new coiffure, a beaten and gleaming gold. She had at last had her hair cut short, just at the moment when the fashion had changed and most women were letting theirs grow. And it was marcelled in exquisite ribbings with little clusters of curls about the ears. I told her my admiration. "I look different, don't I?" she said. "I look like something out of Vogue." "Yes," I said. "It's a new personality, a new kind of beautiful woman." But it was always a personality that did not want itself to be dissolved, and I had vowed to myself to invade it. I took her face in my hands to kiss her. "Oh, you'll muss my hair," she protested. I kissed her carefully, respectfully bending, then sat seriously holding her hand. I told her how natural it seemed to me to have her sitting there in my place, how often I had seen her on the couch whose color I had chosen as a setting for her, how hungrily, coming home from the museum, I had wanted to find her there and to talk about the day over a cocktail. "Yes, you'd tell me about the pictures," she replied in the way that annoyed me. "Edna Forbes was just saying how fascinating it would be to live with a man like you. It would be like having Bernard Berenson and a young man about town at the same time." "Now listen, my dear." I moved. "We mustn't go on like this. It's immoral to want to be lovers and to go on wanting to be and not being. We're getting to be like that Browning poem about the statue and the bust." "Yes, I know," she said. She was troubled and looked away. I followed up by quoting, "The sin I impute to each frustrate ghost is the unlit lamp and the ungirt loin." "I know," she said more decisively. "I've thought about it, my dear, but I can't." "Just because you're married?" "No." "You know I want to marry you. I want you to get a divorce." "Don't say that. You don't know anything about me." "What is it I don't know? Tell me." "Oh, I can't." "Why shouldn't you? I shan't mind whatever it is." "Oh, no, I can't tell you." "What is it? You know that I love you so that I'd understand anything about you. Now tell me what it is." "I can't." "You must. It isn't fair of you not to." "Well, I'm not a well person, you know." "Aren't you really?" "I've told you I had trouble with my back, but you've never known how serious it was." "What's the matter?" I hoped now to find out, and intently I applied my question. "I've got serious spinal trouble. I've got tuberculosis of the spine. It's what they call Pott's disease. Isn't that an awful name? I've had it ever since I was 12. "But you seem to get around all right. You just have to lie up occasionally, don't you?" "I have to wear a brace." It was the final, simple, painful confession. I put my arm around her and kissed her cheek. She had never let me do this before, and now I knew that it had been the brace. She had dreaded to have me feel it. "Why, my dear," I held her close, "you ought to have told me before." "But why should you have thought it would change things?" I felt terribly sorry for her and tender in a quite new way. The defiance I had thought I found in her, the alert and unyielding defenses, had been simply the shame of the brace, a cage, a humiliation in which she had always to live. "I couldn't bear to have a lover," she answered. "You wouldn't want to do something that would hurt me, and you wouldn't really want me now anyway." "Don't say anything so silly, my dear." I smiled to get the tone back to gallantry. "I fell off a horse when I was a little girl, one of my father's horses. I had to wear an awful jacket for almost 2 years, a thing with a rod up the back of my neck and a kind of clamp on the back of my head, like they used to have in old-fashioned photographers' studios. My father wanted me to ride again, right after I'd fallen off. That's why I can never forgive him." "Well, that's what you're supposed to do with children. He probably didn't know how badly you were hurt." "I couldn't walk, I couldn't even sit up, and he wanted me to get right back on the horse." Her voice became appealing as she revived her childish sense of injury. "He really kept a riding stable, I didn't tell you that. When he didn't make a go of his farm, he began hiring out the horses that he'd gotten for the family to ride. I couldn't bear his hiring out my horse that had originally been bought for me. I couldn't always have it when I wanted it, and then when I did ride it, I began to feel when people saw me as if I were just a stable-keeper's daughter, that I was only able to have a horse because my father kept horses for hire. He could never understand how I felt. Wasn't he sympathetic when you were ill? He kept wanting me to try to get up and do without the brace. He didn't want to believe it was really bad because he didn't want to think he was to blame. But was he to blame for your falling off in the first place? In a way, he was to blame. My horse had been so much in demand that I'd gotten out of practice riding her, and she'd gotten so she didn't mind me. The first time I went out with her one spring, I was galloping through the woods, and she took a sudden turn down a path that led home and threw me off so that I hit a stone, and he wanted me to ride again the next day. But you don't wear your brace all the time. No, not all the time. I leave it off sometimes to go out in the evenings, though I have all my dresses made with high necks because sometimes I can't do without it, and sometimes I can leave it off for quite a long time. But I always have to put it on again. My back has been worse lately. That's why I've had to be in bed. You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen or imagined. It may have made you more beautiful in some way. I suppose there's a kind of light that's generated in people from pain. I couldn't go to school. My mother taught me at home. I was bright, and I ought to have gone and gotten to know other children. That's why I've always been so shy. I never went to school after I had my fall. But you've made up for all that now. You know how to handle people, and you've done a great deal more reading than many women who've been to college, and I don't see, I ended, smiling, why it should interfere at all with your love life. I can't have children, she said. You can have love, though, just the same. Oh, I couldn't. It would make me so unhappy, and it would upset everything. It might make you happier, on the other hand. Oh, I couldn't. You wouldn't want to hurt me, would you? You wouldn't want to humiliate me. Why should it humiliate you? It would ruin my whole life and tear me all to pieces. You wouldn't want to do that, would you? And then I wouldn't like you any more. I'd never be able to forgive you. I didn't want to press her at that moment. I must go now, she soon announced. I tried to arrange for another lunch, but she was filled up for days ahead. I don't want to see you for a while. It would make me uncomfortable to see you now that you know about me. You and Ralph and Edna Forbes are the only ones who know. She put her purse under her arm and left. She left me in a state of emotion at once erotic and dolorous. Though my relations with Imogen were clarified and my intimacy with her in a sense advanced, I had to accept a check. It was Saturday. I had asked her then because my Saturday afternoon was free, and I had not made any engagements, and now I had nothing to look forward to but an empty and futile day. I poured a highball of the genuine Scotch that I had specially laid in for the occasion, but which Imogen had not touched, and I sat for an hour or more musing on Imogen and her story. The brace explained everything, of course. It had kept her from believing in her beauty. It had prevented her from giving herself. It was the brace that I should have to surmount. But did I really want to break Imogen down? I should have to work out a new attitude. I had told the maid not to come back, so presently I left the apartment and, thinking I should dine alone, rather purposelessly, started downtown. I wanted, I told myself, to brood quietly on my love for Imogen, to find out how, if at all, it had been altered by the afternoon's revelation. But once I had crossed Fifth Avenue and was wandering among the West 50s, it was as if I were relieved of a strain, a posture which had been cramping my spirit. I forgot about Imogen completely, as I had not been able to do in months. Here, as the night blacked and chilled the city, with the speeded-up pace of the season, I could feel the hot pulse of the appetite inside the hard shell of New York. It reached me from the electric signs that blinked rapidly through rhythmic dramas, in which chewing-gum brownies in green and pink bulbs pricked the night with their arrow-pointed caps. from the livid blue or white-lighted names on nightclubs that were blinded like harems, from the sight of young dancers in their street clothes, with straight backs and well-developed ankles, whom their makeup did not make meretricious. I thought about Ana. She had come back from Syracuse and written me during the summer. Dan, it turned out, had not died, and she had left him in Syracuse. I had answered, not mentioning my illness, but telling her I hoped to see her when I should get back to New York in the fall. And now suddenly I felt I must look her up. I went into a coin booth in a drugstore, and its dinginess and stale cigarette smoke took me back to my nights of 14th Street. As I dialed, my throb of excitement was followed by a recoil of distaste. The thick accents of Anna's mother spoke incredibly out of the black transmitter and told me that Ana was now working at a restaurant only a few blocks away on Fifth Avenue. I walked around there, came in flushed from the cold, self-consciously sat down at a table, seized a wine list, and ordered a drink. Then for the first time I took in the restaurant, which was not what I should have expected. The Field Company had lately been attempting to meet the popular demand for Ritz, and had substituted for their usual homely lunchrooms a kind of Babylonian court with glossy black onyx walls and a gilded cascading fountain, of which the thin even sheet of water, trickily lit from below, looked itself a kind of tinselly gilding. It seemed a queer place to be seeking Ana, but I stared about and presently found her. She was waiting at the counter for an order and showed the same cool detachment toward her tray that she had shown toward her partners at the dance hall. She masked perfectly her surprise at seeing me when I sent her a message by my waitress, and pretended no recognition as she came over to me, unsmiling but blushing. She appeared to me, after my dazzlement with Imogen, rather dry-skinned and pale-eyed and plain under the relentless glare of the lighting, and in her yellow, white-aproned uniform, which was the same in all the Fields restaurants, and which reminded me of the sliced hard-boiled eggs that invariably appeared in their salads. But she smiled when she came up to my table, and I was reminded how sweet her eyes were. In a few curt and low-spoken words, with an eye on the movements of the hostess, she reproached me for not having called her, and agreed to come to see me the next Thursday, which, she said, was her afternoon off. And as she departed to attend to a customer, gave me a roguish and sidelong grin. She turned up looking very attractive. I had feared I should find her sordid. She was wearing a short blue dress and a new cloche hat for autumn, with the white stockings and the blunt-toed black shoes that were part of her waitress's costume. And her long-waisted, slender body seemed to me surprisingly smart, with the dress caught up in front, as the fashion was at that time, and scooped in under her narrow little buttocks. She had had her hair waved for the occasion, and it smelt very clean of tar soap. Her skin was quite fresh and pink, and the color of her dress brought out in her eyes a pretty forget-me-not look that made it extremely difficult for me to suspect her of having deceived me. I found that I was telling her what had happened to me in a more or less objective way, and in the stern but friendly tones of a father who has heard about his young son's getting drunk. She was obviously troubled and depressed. She said that Dan had had something the matter with him, but she didn't know whether it was that. She had discovered in Syracuse that he had some kind of a great big sore. He had wanted her to sleep with him, but she wouldn't. Was that what was the matter with him, I asked? But her answer only further revealed to me the incurious ignorance of the poor in regard to the diseases among which they live, and which they take simply for granted as infestive plagues, a little more mysterious than cockroaches or rats. They didn't want to tell me what was wrong with him. They told me it was a blood clot, but I don't know what it was. He wasn't hardly conscious when I got there. But then he came to and went out and got drunk and came back and knocked me down and kicked me between the legs and made a big cut and was trampling on my face. His father came in and he tried to beat up his father, and they had to call in the police. What I think is he'd just been faking to get me to come on there with him. I reflected how far all this was from the world that the Loomises lived in. They would never have been able to believe it. I could hardly make it real to myself. I could imagine the attitude of Ralph to anyone who treated his wife like that, or even to anyone who said he knew someone who did. Dan had also come and grabbed her pocketbook just when she was getting on the train to leave. He had told her he would meet her in Utica and run her the rest of the way to New York. So for her only to buy a ticket to Utica. She had gone to the hotel, he had told her, and had stayed there for $2 a night, but he had only sent a man with the pocketbook with most of the money gone. Her father-in-law's whole family, she said, had been in very bad shape when she was there. The sister had married a man who had afterwards turned out to be married, and she had had some children by him, and she had finally come back home and treated the children terrible. She took dope, and she'd scream and yell and curse. She'd always say, "I want Ana." I'd stay with her and keep her quiet, see? She'd threaten to kill the children. My mother-in-law couldn't do nothing with her. She's crazy. And my father-in-law's sort of crazy, and Dan's brother is just disgusted. Dan likes his sister, and he don't like to see her like that. I think that was what got him started drinking. I took a vicarious pleasure in feeling how different my apartment must seem from the Lenahans' moral squalor. She was evidently amazed and thrilled. She watched me work the siphon with interest and slipped a Cole Porter record on the phonograph. She lay in my arms on the green, modern couch on which I had pictured Imogen, and eventually we went to bed in my sober and white-walled little bedroom, with its 2 Renoirs and some new blue and green crepe ties that I had hung on a corner of the mirror. The bed had been made up with clean sheets. It was the first time we had had a real bed, and it gave the whole affair a new dignity. I was careful to take no risks. She still seemed to me terribly appealing, and once when I came back into the room, I found her curled up on the bed, and was pleased by her eyes, very cunning and round, at once agate like marbles and soft like burrs, looking at me over her hips. When the rest of her face was hidden, they had also an unexpected depth. Anna's visit relieved my tension. When I walked out of the house the next morning, I met a world that was well thought of and deserved to be, a world that was sound and clear, and to which I was glad to belong. I worked at the Metropolitan. I also did serious writing. I had a mistress who came to see me. As for Imogen, she was slightly trashy, and besides it would be selfish and brutal determinedly to mount my guns against a woman so romantic and so sensitive, who had always been partly crippled. What a formidable undertaking it would be to get her through such an emotional crisis. And once I had set out to prevail over her, I should certainly have to see it through. I should have to detach her from Ralph and adjust her to the new situation. And after all, wasn't it too mean to Ralph? He had been bearing all the emotional costs of her case, and did he not have the right to keep her? When I saw her for a drink 2 days later, I was gentle and affectionately friendly, and quietly forbore to press her. But Ana disappeared into her darkness again. One day, when I was waiting for her, she called me up and said Dan was back. She was going to take Cecile and go to stay with her sister in Manhattan, where he wouldn't be able to find her. Her mother was back again with Fatty. They had moved to a different section, and Ana had been living with them. I felt that her anxiety and the imminence of Dan had for the moment estranged her from me completely. She did not call me up for a week, so I finally stopped in at the restaurant. She hadn't been to work for 2 days, nor had her mother heard anything about her since she had gone to stay with her sister. Dan had found her again, it turned out, and when she finally reappeared, she was disfigured by a cut on her lip, an eye in the purple and green stage, and great bruises on her hips and thighs. She had had to stop working at Fields, and was ashamed to go out on the street. Dan had waited for her outside her sister's and pushed her back into the hallway and beaten her up. He had accused her of being unfaithful, and she had been scared he'd find out about me. Then he had made her get into a car and driven her to a drugstore where they knew her, and made her persuade them to cash a check which she had just seen him forge in his father's name. Then he had taken her to a speakeasy and announced that she was going to live with him and that they were going to find a place right away. They had started to go somewhere in the car, But Dan's driving was now so screwy that a cop had pulled him in and taken them right to court. There Dan had made an impression by producing a Burns Agency badge, which he had kept from a brief period of detective work, and he had almost induced them to let him go, when Ana couldn't stand it and gave him away. She told them that the badge was a fake and that he had just passed a bogus check. The cops had called up the Burns Agency and looked up Dan's record at headquarters and sent him straight to the Tombs. "I didn't want him to get away," she said. "He's so clever. He can talk himself out of anything. When they caught him and Fatty in a stolen car, he made them think that Fatty had stolen it, so that Fatty got 5 years and he only got 1. And I didn't want to live with him no more. I was afraid he'd kill me or do something to Cecile." At first she had been ashamed to go home with her face. Her family had used to make fun of her for the way her husband beat her up, and her aunt that lived in Brooklyn, and whose opinion she highly valued, had, she said, remarked with approval on the fact that she hadn't had no bumps or bruises since she had taken up with me. But when at last she had gone back to her mother's and told them what had happened, they had had nothing but congratulations. They had said she had done right in betraying Dan, and Fatty was particularly pleased. But now she was tormented by conscience. She hoped he wouldn't get a long sentence. It seemed terrible to send somebody to jail when you'd loved them once so much. "You've never been so happy with me as you were with Dan, have you?" I asked. "I was never happy with Dan. I used to cry when he made love to me." "But you didn't always do that, did you?" "Not at first." Then she added, "You've made me feel different about Dan. You're the only person who's ever been nice to me." I tried to reassure her by telling her that Dan must be really insane and that he was better off in jail. "I wish I didn't have to go back," she said. She had not got to my place till 11. "I'm so tired. My eyes sting so. But I have to be there in the morning to get Cecile's breakfast and take her to school." I asked her whether she didn't want to sleep, but she put her arms around me, and we went to bed together. And that night I felt a satisfaction of possessing her perfectly, completely. My arms around her slim little figure, my tongue in her soft little mouth, and her slender legs twined over mine. She slept, and I told her I would wake her at 2. I took her to the subway in the damp winter morning, and when I found myself back, warm and dry, in the bed that still smelt faintly of arrowroot, it made me uncomfortable to think of her, sitting alone on a bench in the station through the hour-long wait between night trains, and of her long, dreary trip to Brooklyn, half overpowered by sleep. It made me uncomfortable to think of her, sitting alone on a bench in the station through the hour-long wait between night trains, and of her long, dreary trip to Brooklyn, half overpowered by sleep. It was, after all, no light undertaking for her to come over to see me at night, especially when she was working at Fields, and after spending the whole day on her feet, was first obliged to go back to Brooklyn to give the little girl her supper and put her to bed. I must make her accept some money to buy Cecile and herself some new shoes. Dan was sent to jail for 2 years, and though Ana had moments of remorse, she was obviously much relieved. She cast off now a good deal of the constraint that she had always felt in coming to see me, and I, on my side, accepted her more freely for the fact that she was detached from Dan. I found it a continual agreeable surprise to realize that she was not common, and that the quality of her intelligence was good. She had, in a sense, never even been Americanized. That is, she had never been vulgarized, as many children of immigrants were, who, in adapting themselves to our cities, had acquired bad manners and a blatancy that, for some reason, seemed much more offensive than any mere peasant crudeness of their parents. She had a Brooklyn pronunciation of English, an accent worn down on the lips of the crowd as the long Brooklyn pavements had been by their feet. But she had somehow, in simplicity and humility, escaped this New World barbarization. I recognized her temperament as Russian, or, more specifically, I suppose, Ukrainian, for she had little of the Russian volatility, and the cadences that were sad in her voice expressed a deadening of resignation rather than the Russian complaint. She was naturally cheerful, well-balanced, amiable, considerate, and sensual, as the Slavs of southern Europe are, and there had survived, through so much that was degraded and harsh, so much that it seemed to me was nightmarish in her life, a clear little power of perception and a cool little faculty of judgment, a realistic sense of the way things were that had never become embittered, a sensitiveness of feeling that had never been dulled, and a humor that had never been coarsened. And I found all this very refreshing after my summer with Imogen's fantasies. There had begun to take place in my sympathies a shift that was gradual but rapid. This change of direction was involved with, it may even have been influenced by, the recent set of my political feeling. In my walks on 14th Street the winter before, I had taken to buying the radical papers, especially the communist press, and I had now become addicted to reading them, and had been spurred to study Marx and Lenin more seriously than I had ever done before. The truth was, I now came to realize that in the days when I had considered myself a socialist, I had tended to think of Marxist revolution as a kind of thing that happened in Europe, that one read about in papers and books, and that one might passionately take sides and dispute about, as one could about Robespierre or Cromwell. But that never seemed an element in one's own real world, or a conceivable possibility for America. But now I was becoming convinced that our well-to-do American groups did constitute a bourgeoisie, and that our American factory workers and farm hands, our poor farmers and fruit pickers and lumberjacks, were in process of being reduced to the position of a dispossessed proletariat, in the senses in which these words had been used by the great socialists in Europe and Russia. I had spent Christmas with my parents in Detroit, and I had seen the deflated city spread out on the bleak, flat land, with its banks collapsed, its factories stopped, and its blocks of stores and houses vacant. The great climax of my father's career had been his feat of devising for General Tires a marvelous coordination between the different departments of the business, producing, distributing, and executive, by which conflicts were to be carefully worked out through a system of interdepartmental committees, so as to save needless effort and cost. Everything was taken care of in this system except the interests of the public and the worker, who had never been considered at all. But when I tried to make my father see this, it only became hopelessly apparent that he regarded the Depression as an act of God, like an earthquake, a drought, or a flood. He was a kind and good-natured man. There was always something boyish about him, and it troubled him that General Tires should have had to lay off its old hands. He contributed with unusual generosity to funds for unemployment relief. But it sometimes made me childishly desperate to be blocked in my arguments with him by his refusal to see the logical reasons which would always prevent the system from working, and his total inability to imagine a world in which free enterprise did not prevail. I suppose I always held it against him, too, that he was culturally inferior to my mother and me. He was proud of my mother's music, and though I know he had at first been disappointed with me, he had never tried particularly hard to dissuade me from studying art. But he had no understanding of either beyond rattling off a waltz on the piano and decorating his office with Remington prints of hunters, sunsets, and moose. My mother got restless in Detroit. The people in Grosse Pointe bored her, and she had come to live mainly in anticipation of her visits to her sisters in the East. She confirmed me in my aversion to the city by laughing at the respectful alacrity with which the members of the oldest French families accepted Mr. Ford's invitations to his antiquarian barn dances and other entertainments. And I finally became rude one day at a dinner where people had been saying, apropos of the unemployed, that the time had arrived when the Americans would have to learn to use their leisure, and when somebody had told with enthusiasm of having been present at the Fords' Christmas party, where a hunchbacked and jolly Ford worker, dressed up as Santa Claus, had handed around the gifts. I felt that Karl Marx and Ana had given me the right to be bitter. I always felt guilty at the moment when I took the train back from Detroit, on account of leaving my mother alone there. I would torment myself for an hour, asking whether I shouldn't have lived there, or at least have made myself in New York the kind of home of which she would have approved and to which I could have asked her for visits. I had been having these pangs of compunction since the days when I had first gone to prep school, and they had always had the effect of making me swear to myself that I would dedicate myself more earnestly to whatever was my ambition at the moment. Today, as I looked out on the Canadian farms, I had a clear and fierce revelation. I had been trying to show in my book how the painting of the 19th century had been influenced by the Industrial Revolution, and now I saw that the union of Imogen and Ralph was a striking, dramatic symbol of the queer combination under capitalism of a disgraceful economic reality and a dissembling romantic screen. Ralph made the money in advertising, that is, in hiring himself out to glorify whatever the industrialists were hoping to manufacture with profit, and Imogen spent the money on domestic settings and panoramas of travel abroad that made it possible for her always to fancy, and for Ralph part of the time to pretend, that their situation was other than it was. But the world of Ana was the real world, the base on which everything rested. She was the worker who gave all that he could give, and who got for it as little as he could live on. I listened to her reports of Field's restaurant with the same kindling indignation with which I had been reading in Das Kapital the hideous industrial chapters. When she had first started in as a waitress, she hadn't been able to afford a girdle, and had got in wrong for wearing rolled stockings, and they had put her at the very back tables where you could only make a couple of dollars. Sometimes she had to stay on her feet all the time through the rainy days when no customers were coming in, and it made her bleed alarmingly when she was having her monthlies. She had never, she said, been right since Cecile was born. She had hoped she might get made a hostess at the first place where she had a job, because the hostess had been nice and liked her and pinched her arm and called her, "You dear little thing." But then this hostess had been transferred, and the new hostess had been terrible to them, and you couldn't throw up your job and get a job at some other fields, because if you just quit, you found yourself on a sort of blacklist, and they wouldn't let you work anyplace else. And then her mother had suffered as a fur worker from flying bits of fur in her eyes, and she had contracted an eczema of the hands, which had made her fingers so sore that she had finally had to stay home and try to get them cured. Ana did not herself play up or even consciously lend herself to my view of her as a victim of the economic system, and it may be that on the one hand I was feeling the need to justify on higher grounds the strong taste that I was beginning to have for her, and that since Imogen, on the other hand, was so difficult, I wished to believe that as a bourgeois escapist, she was not really worth having. Certainly my affair with Ana was saving me trouble and time. I had now only my evenings to write in, and assured of seeing Ana at least once a week, I did not feel any longer, as I had done, the restless and irksome desire to contrive skimpy rendezvous with Imogen, or to go dining and drinking out. In any case, I took a sharp pleasure, which was at the same time aesthetic and sensual, in the contrast between my meetings with Ana and all the other events of my life. I remember one cold winter Sunday when she had come in the afternoon, a day of blank uptown facades and decorous uptown perspectives, when I had gone to the deserted museum to look up something in a book, and returning, I had felt it so incongruous to watch her take off her stiff pink slip, and to have her in her prosaic brassiere, the warm and adhesive body and the mossy damp underparts, the mystery, the organic animal, the prime human oven of heat and juice, between the cold afternoon sheets in the gray-lit Sunday room. And one evening, when I had come home from a party at which I made Imogen smile by my tender and charming gallantries, and kissed her hand at parting, and then made love to Ana for the second time by a sudden revival of appetite after she had put on her clothes to go, by way of her white thighs and buttocks, laid bare between black dress and gray stockings. She was so slim that it was almost as easy to take her from behind as face to face, while she kicked up one foot in its blunt-toed black shoe as a gesture of playful resistance or simply of wanton freedom. In all this period of my meetings with Ana, we had only one unpleasant moment. One night, when I was expecting her, she called me up and asked me to come and get her, something she had never done before, at a restaurant on West 49th Street. It was a curious and ignoble neighborhood, a kind of back stairs for the entertainment district. There were cheap little restaurants and bars, women's wear shops with much lingerie, Chinese restaurants with large signs that said dancing, and hotels at $1.50 a night. I identified the little speakeasy with misgivings. It had the air of a garage, and found Ana with a girlfriend named Irene, who was also a waitress at Field's, and for whom I felt an instant dislike. I thought Ana behaved rather unnaturally. She would not let me take her away, but kept insisting on my buying more drinks. These drinks were the worst I had ever had, even under Prohibition. The gin was stinging and raw. I felt that I had touched a new stratum, which Irene represented too. She did not impress me as a tart, but she was common and covertly malignant in some sort of special way. I felt also that she and Ana had some sort of special understanding, that she was putting Ana up to something. When I finally got them into a taxi, I offered to drop Irene at her subway, but she said she wanted to go to a restaurant where a wonderful man was working, whom she described as her big moment. Ana was all for my taking them there, and to my surprise, when I firmly declined, became vehement in a way quite alien to anything I had known of her before. "You wouldn't do that for me?" she said. "All right, I'll never forget this." When I had finally put off Irene at her subway, I asked Ana what was the matter. She ceased to be aggressive with her friend gone, but was sulky and wouldn't say much. I expressed a low opinion of Irene, and she answered that Irene was her best friend now, and that I didn't care about her anyway. "You must be getting tired of me," she said, "because you're beginning to pick on me." Later on, when I had her at home, I demanded of her several times whether she cared about me still. "I don't like the way you ask that," she said. "All right, if you don't believe me, I could say I did anyway, couldn't I?" The cheap drinks and the Limburger cheese she had given her a bad breath, and she complained of being sick at her stomach. Our love-making was perfunctory. We scarcely kissed, and she turned her head away. Our relationship was chilled for a week. Then suddenly I knew one evening from the way she was laughing with me that I had all her confidence again. She said that the girls at Field's had all warned her that Irene was queer, but she had always refused to believe them. "I didn't have no girlfriend, see? And I thought Irene was such a wonderful girlfriend. She was always so nice to me, you know, and used to take me out and buy me drinks." But one night Irene had induced her to spend the night in her apartment in Manhattan. After Ana had gone to bed on a couch, Irene had rather embarrassed her by walking around the room with her clothes off. But Ana had dropped off to sleep, and then the first thing that she knew, Irene had come over and was down here. Ana had pushed her away and wouldn't go with her any more. Irene had told Ana that night that her husband was a fag, and Ana thought maybe she hadn't always been that way, but she had gotten that way because he was that way. "I think she wants a boyfriend," she said. "You heard her rave about that guy in the restaurant." Not long after this reconciliation, I went to a nightclub with the Loomises. Ralph's agency had lately extended its scope and now placed advertising with radio stations as well as with provincial newspapers. And Imogen had appeared after Christmas with a beautiful baby leopard coat, which brought up for me boyhood memories of the novel by Eleanor Glynn, and a Welsh terrier called a corgi, fox-faced and coffee-colored, which was completely under her domination and snapped savagely at everyone else. They were also doing the town at a rate that I had never known them to do it before, and that evening I had been weak enough to allow myself to be carried along on their spree, telling myself, however, that I was going to pay part of the check. but Anna's wages from Fields had lately been seriously diminished by her sending money to Dan so that he could buy himself food and cigarettes in prison, and I, in turn, had been giving her money so that the scale of prices in the Coronet imposed on me a certain strain. Edna Forbes was also of the party, and at one point in the evening Imogen and she went away to the ladies' room and stayed about 50 minutes. During their absence, Ralph Loomis and I had a long conversation about radio. The fact that he was peddling the commercial plugs that made the radio programs so offensive contributed to my picture of the Loomises as symbols of capitalist culture. But Ralph rather deflected my antagonism by himself deploring the commercialization of radio before I had had a chance to mention it. "We ought to do as the British do," he said, "and have the whole thing directed by the government. Still, I suppose it isn't any worse than reading a story in a magazine and running up against a Campbell's soup ad. They do broadcast a lot of good music." And he described to me his ideal program, which would include the organ chorales of César Franck, a poetry reading by Carl Sandburg, an analysis of current news by somebody from Time magazine, and a monologue by Robert Benchley, whom he had met and liked to call Bob. I pointed out urbanely that the kind of thing he wanted would be impossible to achieve under capitalism, and he admitted that this might be true. The longer the two ladies remained away, the more I found myself warming toward him. He seemed so much less the exploiter than the victim, and since Ralph's current splurge of spending had not been in the least ostentatious, and since I could see that the badness of the radio had given him a feeling of guilt, I thought I might as well let him pay the check. I had been wondering about the absence of the ladies, and Ralph finally showed concern. He must always, I supposed, have to worry about something going wrong about Imogen's back. "They're just talking about us," I reassured him. Our solidarity now seemed complete. "They're telling each other everything they've done since they saw each other last." But they returned a few moments later, Edna in diamond earrings and a white satin evening gown that lent her a certain elegance and almost made her attractive, Imogen in black, with a cowl-like garment that covered her shoulders and back, but left her lovely white arms bare and gave dignity to a beauty that seemed to me tonight, reminding me of Greta Garbo's, at the same time perverse and detached. Ralph invited Edna to dance, but I simply ordered Imogen a highball. "You and Edna ought to dance together," I said kiddingly, but rather crudely. "Do you think we're lesbians?" she answered, with a coloring of cuteness in her voice, and turning upon me her gorgeous eyes that exasperated me by seeming familiar when I knew they were far away. "No, I don't think you're lesbians, but there's always a leak in your relations with men." "What do you mean by that?" She smiled so determinedly that I knew I had touched her. "I mean that you talk everything over with Edna." "No, I don't." "You do. You tell her everything that happens to you. I've got to feel that everything between you and me is enacted in the presence of Edna." "There's nothing between you and me." "Sometimes I feel," I went on, "that all the admiration I give you is just turned into a kind of device for you to get admiration from Edna." "I don't follow you," she said rather sternly. "You know," I tried to keep it amusing, "there are times when it all seems like something in a story in a woman's magazine. One of those stories in which the heroine is a married woman who manages to eat her cake and have it, too. She goes alone on a trip to the West Indies, and on the boat she meets a wonderful man who is glamorous, passionate, and handsome. He takes her up on the top deck and kisses her while the moonlight is silvering the ocean. The reader holds his breath for several columns, because he thinks she is going to fall and just throw over her husband and her family. But then, in the nick of time, it turns out that the guy is a swindler who has been fleecing the passengers at cards, and she suddenly gets a cable from her husband in which he tells her that he is meeting her in Havana. It has suddenly been revealed to him in her absence that he had come to neglect her lately, and he is terribly in love with her again, and so they have a second honeymoon in Cuba. Everything has been perfectly painless, nobody has suffered at all, but the woman who wrote the story has communicated to the woman who reads it some daydream she likes to indulge. The other woman has been having that daydream, too. She would like to run off with a man of the world, and now she can imagine it more vividly and yet afterwards be left feeling virtuous. And that's what you do with Edna, and you do it at my expense." "What's wrong with that picture," said Imogen, "is in the first place that my husband doesn't neglect me, and in the second place that I don't want to elope with anybody, and in the third place that I'm not a card sharp. But if you really knew about my life, I'm afraid you'd be just as much horrified." I knew I was behaving badly. I did not see her again for a month. In the meantime, just as I, at that time, had felt the impulse to confess about Ana to Imogen, so Ana had come to shrink from visiting her husband in prison for fear she should have to talk about me. She did not go to see him or write him for nearly 3 weeks, she said, and then she got a letter from him that made her cry. He accused her of making whoopee while he was locked up, and of being unfaithful to him. "But what Christ-like creature," the letter went on, "am I not to forgive you? I know that I am a phony crook and a liar, and that I haven't been fair and just to you, but I still love you like I always did. Pay no attention to what other people say about me. Use your own judgment. I am only in here 2 years, and that is only 21 months more, and I expect to live with you 50 years if you will have me. I'm going to be in the Washington's birthday show, and the director thinks I am hot. I am going to sing a song for you in the show. Bring Cecile over to see it." But when she had gone to see him, she came back more frightened than ever. "He looked terrible. He just stared at me first, and didn't say anything, like he was sore. Then I talked to him and told him I still loved him and everything, and after a while he calmed down. He thinks that everybody's through with him. He's a bad egg, I know it. He's just about as bad as they come. I'm afraid of him. I'm afraid he'll cut me up. He said he wouldn't kill me because he doesn't want to burn in the chair, but that he'd do something terrible to me." She had used to wake up in Syracuse and find him glaring at her with crazy eyes. He was so jealous, he hadn't wanted her to dress well, had tried to make her wear old clothes of his mother's. And then Cecile had just heard for the first time about where her father was. The kids had found out at her school. They had asked her why her father wasn't home, and then shouted, "Because he's in prison, that's why he isn't home." "That's a fine thing for her to hear," said Ana. "I still didn't tell her the truth." Then suddenly, Dan died. She had known that there was something the matter with him because she had used to see him in the morning with pus all over his lips. They had had x-rays taken of his nose, and now they said at the jail that what he had had was a tumor of the brain. They had operated on him on the island, and he had died right away. They had notified her that his body had been sent to the morgue, and she and his father had gone to claim him. She hadn't wanted to have Cecile have to go to the morgue, but they were taking the body to Syracuse, and she thought that she ought to see him. It turned out that she was tickled to death because she had known her father so little and had always been looking forward to having him back. Ana went on to Syracuse, and Dan's family gave him a Catholic funeral, with all kinds of expensive features paid for out of Dan's insurance, including a special coffin that was supposed to keep the body for 100 years. Her father-in-law had tried to give Ana what was left of the life insurance, but Ana had refused to accept it because the last time she had been in Syracuse, he had told her that it was she and her people who had ruined Dan's life. When she came back after her absence of 5 days, she found that she was out of a job. The manager wouldn't have her back. He didn't like her because he was a wop, and once when he had asked her, "Can you understand English?" she had come back at him with, "Yes, can you speak it?" And now she had been trying a week, and she hadn't been able to find a job, and she wished she had taken the insurance. "Big-hearted me," she said scornfully. Dan haunted her still for a time. She slept, she told me, way over on the side of the bed, even when Cecile wasn't with her, for fear he might still be there. She had destroyed the X-ray photographs, and so hadn't been able to send them when he was going to be operated on, and she was afraid that he might have died for that reason. And then she hadn't gone to see him when he had written her the last time, begging her to come. One night she read a ghost story in the paper. She thought it must be true because she'd read it in the paper. And she couldn't go to sleep all night for imagining he was outside the window. The way he'd looked at the morgue. They'd just had him there lying on the floor. They hadn't even put him in the icebox with the others. But the shadow eventually faded, and she seemed to me, almost as I watched her, like a crocus set free from dead leaves, which have been keeping it stunted and bent, to straighten up and take on her own color. She was more self-assured, more mature, and she seemed to me even taller. She came more often now to spend the night, which she had rarely been willing to do before. There was an interval when she was out of a job and when I gave her enough money to live on, and at this time she was freer and more mine, and we were having more fun together than had been possible at any time before. She arrived fairly early one evening when she had not waited for dinner at home, and I went out to buy her some beer and some delicatessen sandwiches. While I was doing this, she took a hot bath, and when I got back I found her combing her hair and looking very pretty and clean in a pair of my white pajamas that had several buttons missing. I was beginning to cease to feel, as I had the winter before, that she was a wisp of irrelevant romance that I had brought home from a 14th Street dance hall, a beast or bird picked up in the fields that could never be a household pet. And tonight she was there before me as the creature I had actually caught. A pretty little Slavic girl with a round face, a flattish nose, nice soft hair that was parted in the middle, and that tonight seemed rather blonde than red, and clear, foreign, light green eyes that slanted up a trifle at the corners, and that looked as if they had been washed like the rest of her. And she smelt sweet of powder and soap. I had bought her some first-rate cosmetics. She curled up against the wall on the couch, and I sat opposite in the modern armchair, and she ate sandwiches, and we both drank beer. I talked about the Russian Revolution. "I know," she would say, and I could see that she did know it as a serious fact on the horizon of her mind. She had heard it discussed by her Ukrainian relations, some shopkeepers, some garment workers, but she had no political views, and when I tried to make her understand that a working-class government in Russia might have repercussions over here, that business slumps with the hardships that they inflicted on people like her family could only be prevented by a socialist revolution put over by people like them, I felt that I was merely embarrassing her by consigning her to the category of a working class. To tell her that the fur workers like her mother, the garment workers like her cousins, and the waitresses at Fields like herself were expected to dislodge their employers and the big figures she read about in the papers, and to make themselves the rulers of society, must seem to her, I could see by her silence, to be thrusting on herself and her people a role for which she knew they were not fitted, and for which I must know they were not, so that I soon began to feel silly and insecure. And my Marxist way of talking seemed at the same time to imply that Ana and her family were at present such underprivileged beings as to have been practically outlawed from humanity, when the fact was that she and I, in our manners with one another, and in the freedom with which we had both bound ourselves, as it were, by emotional contract, were meeting on equal terms, so that to force into the situation the conception of the Marxist proletariat was to be guilty of not merely bad taste, but of violence against everything that was good between us. I found myself embarrassed, too, and dropped the subject and gave her more beer. Soon I was laughing with her over her cat, which had just been having kittens. They had taken in this cat from the street. "My mother likes cats," she said, "and Fatty, he likes cats too, so she always has plenty to eat. She was going to have kittens, so we gave her a box. But she had to have somebody around. She wouldn't let me leave the room, so I had to stay in the kitchen all the time. Finally, I had to go out, and when I started to go out the door, she ran over and bit me in the leg and dropped the kitten. So then she had her kittens. It's funny how they eat the afterbirth. The kittens wanted to nurse just as soon as they were born. They all began to yell like hell. Cecile just loves them to death, but I'm afraid the old cat will scratch her." Cats played quite a part in their lives. She had told me that when she was little, she had used to save milk for stray cats, and once she had been upset about finding a little kitten in the street that had been all chewed up by a dog, and the children had been torturing it and throwing water on it. She had gone to a policeman, and he had told her that the SPCA was closed after 5, and he had laughed at her and said it would die. So she had gone to a drugstore, and they had laughed at her, but sent a boy out to kill it with chloroform. As I watched her, lying back on the cushions, I saw that she looked rather like a kitten herself. She said that she had been all tired out with the cats and her sister's children, whom she had invited over to Brooklyn to celebrate Cecile's birthday. She had been comfortably relaxed by her bath, and the beer had made her sleepy, and she did not feel much like making love. She carefully cold-creamed her face, and we went to bed in perfect tranquility. For me, too, it was a kind of relief to share thus in her relaxation, to have her gentle young body beside me all night in my own bed. I had said good night in the dark to the cunning shadowed hollows of her eyes, and kissed her twice on her little mouth, and she had turned from me away toward the wall. As I lay with my arms around her, and sometimes pressed against her, she would say, "Well, let's go to sleep," but responded with a soft little pressure, and finally I turned her around. The next morning at 8 o'clock I came out and found a capable young woman in a well-cut and hung green dress ironing her apron in the living room. She had got a new job at Crafts, and that day was going to work again. The whole evening and night were to leave on me through everything I did the next day an impression of sweetness and dearness, of affection and satisfaction. And in the interval of 5 days before I saw her again, I found my hunger for her becoming obsessive. I noted that I was getting into a phase where I constantly imagined I saw her in people I passed on the street who might hardly have anything in common with her. And as I walked through the rooms of the museum, in certain of the Italian Madonnas, and in the grave little New England bride of the American Hawthorne's trousseau, who did not really look much like her either, but who had something unpretending and childlike that I had come to associate with Ana. But when she came to me next, she was ill. She had been menstruating, and her work at the restaurant had, as usual, made it worse. She had not wanted to confess this at first, but at last she lay down on the couch and mentioned that she felt faint. She had dark places under her eyes, she was pale, and her hair looked dull. She complained that she could not eat the food at Crafts because she had to see it all the time, and she knew how lousy it was, but that when she had come home from work, she had not had the energy to go out and get vegetables and milk and fruit, so that she hadn't had anything to eat but pork, which was what Fatty always got. Her mother used sage tea to dye her hair, and then she would eat out of the saucer she'd made it in, and this disgusted Ana and took her appetite away. And she had also had a fight with them which had upset her. She was not used to having people take care of her. She was always surprised when I brought her things, if only a drink of water or a light, which she said Dan had never done. And she had never let me send her to a doctor. But I got her to go to bed and drink part of a glass of sherry. I sat beside her and held her left hand, and noticed again how finely it was shaped. The desire with which I had awaited her had been subtilized and diffused into tenderness. I said to myself suddenly, I must love her. I told her I would sleep on the couch and let her have the bed to herself, and had to quiet her oh don'ts and oh no's. Say something sweet to me, I begged her as I kissed her good night on the pillow. She said, darling, and then added, I can't say it, and touching her breast, it's all here. She called me in the morning, the next day I was to see her, and told me she was sick in bed. I made her promise to get a doctor, and she wrote me a note that she was better. She never would phone me when her people were there, because she tried to keep up a pretense that she spent her nights out at a girlfriend's. But when I called up her house 2 days later, her mother told me that Ana was still in bed, and the old lady spoke English so badly that it was impossible for me even to be sure that she understood the questions I asked. So I felt I must go over to Brooklyn and find out what the situation was. I had never seen her house or her family, and the journey brought a certain suspense. When I went down into the black dugout of the subway and took the train that banged and hurtled through the straight narrow tube, it was as if I were engaging myself in some logical course of procedure which would force me to a harsh recognition I had hitherto kept at a distance. We shot out of the tunnel at Brooklyn Bridge, and I looked down through the rows of dark girders that wove back and forth like a mechanical loom on the city shown in dark silhouette above a livid and leaden water that seemed to shine at one edge white-hot, and on those streets of the east side where Ana had been born, with their dingy roofs packed tight for miles, shouting here at the escaping train, from the walls and the tops of their buildings their last cries to come and buy fine values, in raincoats, in furs, in candy, in laxatives, in 5-cent cigars. And I was caught for a moment by a vision of that immensity of anonymous life, which, though I knew it only through Ana, had thus come for me alive at one point, like the screen in the blotted theater that is peopled by the animated shadows of persons not really present, whom one never may see in the flesh, though in this case I knew that they existed and had the heat and the accents of life, and that the dramas they acted were real, and I was moved by a kind of awe. Then we went down into the blackness again, and finally emerged from the tunnel in a raw landscape of tracks and garages, gas tanks, one-story factories, and bleak little cheap brick houses in which the factory workers evidently lived. This was Anna's own country, I said to myself. I might as well accept it at once. But I was surprised when I got out at the stop which was the closest to Anna's address. I walked along under low-columned cloisters, pale brown and a little more gracious than anything connected with the subway on the Manhattan side of the bridge, and emerged from the subway steps into the sunlight of a whole new world, which seemed to me inexplicably attractive. It was 12th Street, just off King's Highway, not far from Coney Island and Brighton Beach, and there was space and ocean air and light, and what seemed to me, it was what most astonished me, an atmosphere of freedom and leisure quite unknown on the other side. The great thing here was that there were so few high buildings. The tallest were apartment houses that ran only to 7 or 8 stories, and there were not very many of these. And for the rest, one found little brick shops, delicatessen stores, beauty parlors, drugstores, billiard rooms, kosher butchers, and newsstands with Italian and Jewish papers that had been relatively newly built and that looked absolutely toy-like. These cropped up in patches at intervals among streets that were exceptionally wide and that seemed to go on forever, yet more or less of a sameness though they were, had somehow escaped from the abstract monotony characteristic of American cities. They were planted with rows of young maples, now beginning to be green with April, and the houses, double affairs though they were, placed each at a good distance from its neighbors, seemed quite independent dwellings, not unpleasantly paired, rather than cramping partitioned units, and though they were all fairly small, had been planned with, I thought, a pleasant eye to the amenities. For each had its own little backyard and garage, and its little privet hedge on the street, its latticed shades in the windows, its arched doorway with a diadem of bricks that rayed out around the top, and its little flight of steps in front with an ornamental patterned stone bowl in which nasturtiums or geraniums grew. These avenues and houses were further redeemed from their tendency toward uniformity by the children with whom they were populated, and who, even in this period of poverty, seemed remarkably healthy and clean. There were babies being wheeled in baby carriages that had what seemed to be a great luxury of springs, and young girls with mature round breasts that bulged out under the surfaces of their sweaters, and there were also their ample mothers leaning out of the ground-floor front windows, and occasionally a black-browed Sicilian in suburban American clothes tinkering with his car, or an old Jew walking solemnly and stiffly, a derby hat on the front of his head pulled down over his somber eyes. I found Ana in one of these houses, to my surprise one of the neatest and cutest. I remembered, though I had previously forgotten, that they had only moved into it the fall before, and that she had talked about it enthusiastically. "Oh, I do love that house. I sit right over the radiators, as if it had been the only one of her homes in which she had had enough heat in winter, and had hoped they could rent rooms to boarders so that they wouldn't have to give it up. But I hadn't divined its attractions. I felt better as I rang the bell, but when her mother had answered the door, and I had followed her down to the basement, I saw that they were certainly poor, and I grasped what it meant to be poor.